I was asked to give a history of the Muslim community in Dearborn, and it's really kind of hard to talk about the Muslim community in Dearborn without talking about the Muslim community in the Detroit area. So I've sort of made my talk a little bit more Dearborn-centric than it otherwise is, but just bear with me because the Muslim community here in Dearborn does not live in isolation from the other Muslim communities in the metro area. So make sure I can get this. So I'd sort of like to start by thinking about the early Muslims who came to Detroit in the early 20th century. So this is a letter that was published. I realize I usually have like one book that I speak with, and this I'm like, oh no, that's the one quote I didn't single out because I'm not going to be able to read it from the slide. But so this is a letter that was written from Detroit, and it says, "My advice to the Mohammedans in America," which was published in 1922 by an imam, a religious leader who was who had worked in Highland Park at the first mosque that opened in Highland Park, and he'd been in Detroit for a year. And this is this letter that he sends out to America. And bear with me, because I really do want to read parts of this, even though I didn't get this ahead of time. I do have an index, so it should be easy to find it. Just because it's like really gives an idea. Oh man. Okay, maybe I can't do it. I won't be able to find it. Okay, well let me see what I can do. So he says, "There are many Mohammedans in this country who come from Syria, Palestine, Albania, Serbia, Bosnia, Turkey, Kurdistan, and India. Their exact number is yet unknown. But they are in thousands. Ooh. This epistle is addressed to all of them. I beg to be excused to say that in the majority of cases you are Muslims in name only, Islam not playing practical part in your everyday life. Nay, even your names are generally no longer Muslim because you have adopted American names. These are the days of trouble for you. The Muslims are being disturbed and dispersed everywhere. The United States is a very great country for you to live in. I wish millions of Muslims to come over here, settle in this land, make it their homes, and enjoy privileges of the citizenship in this free, fertile, and rich land. But I must advise you." All right, so what is your impression of that quote? What is that suggesting to you?
You're here and you lost the way.
Yeah, this was written in 1922, right? It's America for you is a land of freedom and opportunity, but you better beware, because it also is a place that's going to rob you of your Muslim names, of your cultural identity, right? So I like this quote because it's really this thinking that set me about in my research project. So in 2005, 2006, I was sort of looking around for a dissertation research topic, and I was also at the same time doing a survey of the Muslim community in Detroit today. There are over 90 mosques in the metro area, and we were looking and sort of talking to people about the history of their congregation, their individual congregation. But one thing that didn't exist, and this is in 2005, 2006, remember, shortly after 9/11, right, when people were kind of saying, oh, Muslims are strange and foreigners and a threat, why wasn't there a history, right? I knew the community had been around a while. Why hadn't it had a history, right? So I think that kind of text helps explain why, right? So we'll get to that. So when I set out to do this research, these were the tropes when I interviewed older people in the Muslim community, people who founded the Islamic Center of America, or who founded the American Muslim Society, or, you know, name your mosque. I talked to Imam Wahbi Ismail, who was the first imam of the Albanian congregation here, right? And when you talk to people in Detroit, they had a way of talking about the Muslim past here, the Muslim communities that were here when they got here, right? They might have arrived in 1950, or they might have arrived in 1990. Right, but this was the way people had. That the early Muslim community wasn't really that religious. That their mosques were really social clubs. That was a club, it was Nadi Hashmie. That means Hashmie Hall. Hashmie's, so Hashmie Hall was like the club, the Hashemite club. Wasn't really a mosque, right? The Muslim community at the period wasn't really involved politically. If they had been more political, things would have gone differently in the Middle East, for example. And that the community was divided, very isolated in these ethnic racial communities. They hadn't really shared a common past. They hadn't known each other in the past, right? And then the final one was that that there were these divisions between Sunnis and Shia in the community, and that they were painful divisions. And everyone I talked to said, oh, well, the Sunni and Shia used to get along, we used to all be a part of the same community until so-and-so, and they'd name someone. Until this person came and he divided us. It could be, Imam Kazwini, who came in like in the 1990s. It could be, Sheikh Shirri. We all got along till Sheikh Shirri came. It could be Sheikh Bezi, who was here in the teens, right? It's like whoever your political leader is of relevance. It was always, and so this one seems to go against those other ones, because it's like the one situation where there's an idealized past. But again, it reinforces this idea that people weren't really religious, that they weren't really educated enough to promote the religion among their children, right? And to me, when I started doing my research, these ideas, you'll see that they're not ideas that I necessarily found reinforced in the literature. And that illustration from Mufti Sadiq that I started the talk with, right? You're no more, religions in name only, or not even your names. That this kind of text, I encountered this kind of text written over and over again in the life of the Muslim community. So just to give background, so if you go back to the early turn of the century, you had Muslim immigrants coming to America, mostly from the former Ottoman Empire. It was still the Ottoman Empire at the time, but from Eastern European countries that had been under Ottoman domain. You also had a lot of people coming from what was at the time known as Greater Syria, the Syrian province of the Ottoman Empire, which is today Lebanon and Lebanon and Syria mostly, and Palestine too. So you had a mix of people coming. Henry Ford, once he got the Highland Park factory really taking off, he actually was trying to recruit. He imported workers from India, because at one point he was hoping to open a factory in India. So he brought a bunch of Indians here and taught them how to manage a factory, to run his factory in India. So there were Indians here, even though there were racial exclusion laws which made it impossible for Indians to naturalize. So anyway, we had this very diverse Muslim community in the United States in this period. The American Mohammedan Society is sort of the first place where you see people coming together and incorporating as a Muslim organization. That was in New York City. That was Eastern European Muslims. In 1914, you had, in Highland Park, Michigan, you had a Muslim housing cooperative that got started. Again, you had a lot of people who were here from Turkey and India and from Syria. And they didn't always speak English. They needed a little assistance, so they started this housing cooperative. In 1916, you saw the Arabian American Society that was started in Highland Park. This was people specifically from the south of Lebanon, what today in Arabic we call the Janub. These are the people from Bint Jbeil and Tivnin and that area. Very patriotic society. They participated in all the Americanization campaigns and all the big marches and things like that around Highland Park. But one of their main goals was also to teach the religion to their children. The United Muslim Association opened in 1916. In 1916, again, the United Muslim Association implies that it was bringing together all these different Muslim groups. There were chapters in Cleveland, there were chapters in Toledo, there were chapters in Buffalo, New York, there were chapters in Chicago. Right, the Midwest was becoming a center, the Great Lakes region was becoming a center for Muslim life in America, because the new immigrants who were coming to America in this period sort of skipped over New York and skipped over the East Coast and came to where the economy was really opening up in this period, which meant this part of the country. So, and that group was headquartered in Detroit, which tells us that Detroit was really a center of these different Muslim communities that were arriving in the period. In 1916, the Red Crescent Society, the Turkish Red Crescent Society, got started to support the war effort in Turkey. They sent a lot of money home. They bought a whole ship filled with medical goods and shipped it back to Turkey. Khairat al-Ummah is another group sort of as similar to the Red Crescent Society. Again, it was headquartered in Chicago and Detroit. So this is just to give you an idea. In 1922, the India Club started, and it was a mix of Indians of all religious backgrounds, but the Muslims worshipped in their clubhouse. Right? So this is just to give you an idea that there was a lot happening in the country in this period, and specifically in Detroit. So the thing that really made a difference in terms of why so many Muslims came to this area, probably the same reason a lot of your ancestors, regardless of who you are, came to this area, right? It was the $5 workday. And I have a recording of Sheikh Khalil Bezi, who was one of the first imams in Michigan. And when he was interviewed in the 1960s by a historian named Alixanaf. And he talks about when he came from the south of Lebanon, he didn't speak any English. His brother had made a tag for him, which he pinned to the outside of his jacket, that said, that had his arrival point, get on this train, put my brother on this train, here's the money for this fare, that got him all the way here to Detroit. And when he got off the streetcar right here at the corner of Manchester and Woodward Avenue, right, he did not then have instructions to his brother's house. So he was all worried, what am I going to do when I get there to that corner? And he got off the streetcar and he said, everybody around me was Arab. They were all Arabs. They were all speaking Arabic. Everyone was from Vintage Vale. He was so happy, right? And indeed, this neighborhood right around the Highland Park factory, it was just on the other side of Woodward, there was a street called LaBelle Avenue, which if you read the newspapers of the period, they're talking about LaBelle, the street of all nations. There's so many different ethnicities there. But some of these other streets were the Syrian community that was moving to the area at the time, they were really heavily settled by the Syrian community. And again, this is just some of the diversity of the Muslim community that was here in this period. So if you're a new minority religious community to America, right, you have some challenges that you have to face. Like if you're from a village in Lebanon, or even if you're from a place like Beirut, you've probably never had to organize a house of worship by yourself. That's not how mosques are really organized in the region. Wealthy patrons will build a mosque and then build like an endowment to go next to it that will support the mosque, right? They're not necessarily voluntary organizations the way American religious institutions are. You also, so you have to build these viable institutions. That's hard. It's hard, especially if you're new to a country, you're working really hard, you're trying to get your family established, you're trying to raise money and bring relatives from the old country. This takes some effort. Also, if you're from a small religious group that is not, commonly well understood in America, one thing that you're asked to do all the time is to represent your faith to others. And I don't have all the pictures here of all the Muslims going out talking about Islam and defending Islam in America. And this time, people were very concerned about the Armenian genocide. And we had lots of ideas about polygamy and about Muslim violence against Christians that were very common in the media. And so the Muslim community in this period had a lot of work to do to kind of represent their faith the way they understood it. Also, you have to have a viable politics. Right, that creates a strong sense of community among people. You have to have the ability to educate your children. This is one of these are why people build mosques. Right, a lot of people come together. Those are the organizations I had on the slide before. Those were all really nice institutions, but they were mostly sponsored by Turkish immigrants or Eastern European immigrants that didn't have families here. The Turkish government wouldn't let women come to America for the most part. So a lot of the Turks who came here to the Detroit area didn't have wives. The people who first started building the mosques that would survive, the mosque I'm going to talk to you about today, they were the Syrian community because there were men and women in that community both, and they wanted to educate their children. They wanted to find partners, marriage partners for their children, right? So the future, they were really building these institutions, the ones with staying power for families. And then, of course, you have to have religious services, right? You have to be able to bury your dead. You have to be able to educate the kids, celebrate the religious holidays, all those things, perform weddings, right? So this is why people want religious institutions. Okay, gotta get used to that. So the other thing we need to understand is that, I think a lot of us think about Detroit, we think about decline, population loss, decline. The other thing that's really remarkable about Detroit history is how quickly the city became a city. Just look at these numbers. I mean, in 1910, the population of Detroit was less than 500,000. 10 years later, it was almost 1 million. Imagine living in a city that doubles from 500,000 to 1 million in a 10-year period. Right? So even if your ancestors didn't work in the Ford Highland Park factory, right, odds are they were doing something like putting down sewer lines or building roads or building houses, right? There was a ton of opportunity in this area, and people were rushing here from all over the world and all over the country. And I have the numbers for Highland Park, which is where that factory was built, from 4,000 to 47,000 in a decade. Again, that's amazing. And Dearborn wasn't quite on the map yet, but it very quickly was. I mean, you can see that it grew really quickly as well. So here we go. So this is the first mosque that was built in the United States of America as a mosque. Right, So it's not the first place where people worshiped, but it's the first purpose-built mosque. And it was built by two brothers, really. One's name was Muhammad Karub, and the other's name was Hussein Karub. So anybody in the room knew one of those brothers?
I knew one of the daughters of the brothers.
You knew one of the daughters, and you knew Imam Hussein. Yeah. So these men came. The first, Muhammad Karub came to America, and he worked on the East Coast, and he heard about the jobs in Detroit, and he heard about the Muslim community in Detroit. One thing he heard was that there was not an imam here. So he had a brother who was studying Islam in the Salina Mosque in Damascus, and he said to his brother, he went back to Lebanon to get married, bring his wife to America with him, and he convinced his brother, they need an imam. They've got all these Muslims, they've got no imam. So his brother came with him to Detroit, right? So he brought his brother here to be a religious leader for the community. He bought a house in Highland Park just before World War I started, and when the war ended, he sold the house for something like 5 times what he bought it for, right? So he immediately went into property development, made a lot of money for himself. And he started raising money. He and his brother traveled around the country. They went to all these cities I've already named in the Midwest. They went out to South Dakota. They went to Iowa, other places where there were people from the Bekaa Valley, which is really, they're not from the Bekaa Valley, but the majority of the Sunni Muslims in this area were from there. So they just kind of went where there was a network of kin and family and people knew each other, and they raised money for this mosque. And here they are. This is a newspaper story from the Detroit Free Press. This is the opening day celebration of the mosque. So you might notice that there are 3 religious leaders in the picture. Imam Karub is the one on the right. The one on the left is Khalil Bezi. He's the one I mentioned getting off the train and being so surprised that everybody spoke English. Khalil Bezi was not trained as a religious scholar, but he was a very pious man. And when he came to Detroit, the people in the Shia Muslim community really sort of respected his piety, and they said, okay, we're going to pray behind you, right? They sort of nominated him to be their religious leader. And then he did eventually really pursue religious education and sort of really followed that career in his life. So we had the Sunni Lebanese imam and a Shia one here working together in this mosque. And the guy in the middle is Mufti Sadiq. He's the guy who penned that text that I read to you in the beginning, right? So for scholars, again, we're going to look at him in this picture. Then we're going to see that 6 months later he penned that text, and we're going to think this is a critique that he has of the Muslim community here in Detroit, right? But in reality, here he was with a Muhammad and a Hussein and a Khalil, people who still spoke Arabic, people who were working really hard to build a mosque. And indeed, they opened this mosque in 1921. I believe I have the text from Mufti Sadiq spoke English. So, yes?
Shelley, where was it? Was that Highland Park? Was that Detroit? Where at the location of that?
This is Highland Park. This is on Manchester. Sorry, I'm glad you asked that. This is Manchester. Sorry, it's not on Manchester. It's on Victor. Victor is 1 street beyond Manchester. So this is literally a block and a half from the entrance, from that Manchester entrance to the Ford factory. This is right there.
Is it still there?
It's long gone.
Yeah.
It's long gone, yeah. Believe me, if it were there, you would have seen big splashes in the media about this, because, and so many people go and they take pictures of the lot. I think there's a radio station there now. But anyway, just to go back to this, so Mufti Sadiq was an Indian missionary. He was from the Ahmadi tradition, or the Ahmadiyya, as some of you might know. And he came to America because he was very frustrated. A lot of people from his community were converting to Christianity in order to get promoted from within these positions they had within the British Empire. So he was really angry at the British for coming and being a colonial authority in India and for trying to convert Muslims. So he said, well, I'm going to go to the West, to the belly of the beast, and I'm going to convert Christians. So when he decided to come to America, he was actually arrested and taken into custody as soon as he arrived because the government said that he was here to promote polygamy. Remember I said the government had a thing about Islam in this period. And so while he was in prison for a few weeks. While he was in prison, they did a lot of news stories about him. And one of the things he said to the media is, I'm here to preach Islam, but I'm not here to tell people to break American laws. It's not, Muslims don't have to practice polygamy. They're allowed to, but if it goes against the laws of a country, well, then they're not allowed to. They have to, if the laws of the country don't contradict our major laws, they have to obey those laws, right? So anyway, he talked his way out of prison. But while he was in prison, he converted like 20 people. All the people in the cells around him converted to Islam. So anyway, so the people in Detroit heard about him, and they were really impressed because he had several honorary degrees from British and other European universities, and they really needed someone who could do that job of representing Islam to the public. So they invited him to Detroit to work with them. And here he is. This is the first Muslim mosque built in this land, and I'm proud to have the first prayer as the first imam. This mosque, although built for the followers of Islam, will be open to the believers of all religions for a place of rest, prayer, and meditation. Mohammedans believe in worshiping but the one God. Muhammad, on whom peace be peace and the blessings of God, is a prophet of God. The religion of Islam treads underfoot all racial prejudices, and that's a really important line. So I will tell you that Mufti Sadiq didn't last very long in Detroit. He went to Chicago. In fact, the Ahmadi tradition is a sort of it's not sort of one of the mainstream religious traditions. They believe that there's a prophet who came after the Prophet Muhammad, Ahmed. That's why they're called the Ahmadiyya. And Mufti Sadiq wasn't just interested in converting Americans to Islam. He was interested in converting Muslims to the Ahmadi tradition. So he had the newspaper that he ran had each week he would run a column in it, or every time the publication came out, it was a quarterly. He would publish the names of the people who had converted. So if Sally Howell became a Muslim, he would say Sally Howell, and then in the next column he would give me a name like Salwa Hawa, right? And in the second issue of the paper, and the paper, by the way, was sponsored by the Karub family. So the Karubs put him up in an apartment. They bought a printing press because they really wanted this to be the center of the Muslim community in America, right? So they sponsored this guy, and the second issue of the Muslim Sunrise, his publication, included an interesting column. So they had a third brother, Osman Karub, and it had his name as Osman Karub Ahmadi. So you get that they converted his brother to the Ahmadiyya sect. So he got kicked out of town to Chicago. But I still want to say this line right here. So just to sort of go against those points I made at the beginning of the talk, that's sort of the way people represent Islam in the past. This line is incredibly important, and it gets repeated over and over again. The religion of Islam treads underfoot all racial prejudices. He took this seriously. The imams he was working with took this seriously. It wasn't just immigrants who were moving to Detroit in this period. It was also a large number of African Americans who were moving up here from the South to escape Jim Crow conditions. And a lot of them were experimenting with new religious identities, new cultural identities. And Mufti Sadiq found that the number one group of people in America who were open to his message of Islam were African Americans. So his mission in Chicago was focused really specifically on the African American community. Here's the publication that they ran, and you see Detroit isn't literally in the center, but it's sort of, nonetheless, this is the Muslim community of America. So the first mosque, actually, it didn't last very long. So, I've already said there were a lot of different people there. It was symbolically very important, but they didn't have a lot of experience in terms of how to raise money for the mosque. There were so many things. So I don't know if I can actually read this one. Sorry, I couldn't switch it on my slide. I switched format. Anyway, this basically argues, this little text on the side here. So the Detroit newspapers loved to write about the Muslim community in this period, by the way. There was a lot of evidence from the period. Faith of Islam withers in Detroit atmosphere. Right, so what was it that was withering? It was really a question about how to fund the mosque. And there was infighting over money, which is, wow, no one who started a voluntary, every community has this issue, right? How do you raise money for things? But there was another reason that, oh man, I'm skipping ahead here. But this was the other reason. This was the other reason the mosque didn't succeed. So what's that a picture of? The Rouge factory. Yeah, so that mosque opened in 1921. And in 1921, the Muslim community, the Arab community, was already moving here to Dearborn. They were following forward. They were working to build the factory. They were building houses in the South End neighborhood for themselves and their families. Right, so they built a mosque in Highland Park and want it to be the center of the Muslim American universe, right? And their congregation is already moving to Dearborn. That was sort of one of the main underlying reasons that the mosque didn't do so great. But anyway, so I like this picture too. You can't really see it very well. There's a picture of Khalil Bazi in here. He's right here. This is a funeral that took place in the 1920s, 1923, I believe. And I like this because, again, it shows so many things. So it shows Americanization. We have the band over on the right, which every graveyard in this period had a big band that would perform and would come and play at the graveside for you. The Lebanese community. This isn't really a part of the way people get buried in Lebanon, but it was part of the Americanization process. I love it because they have two flags, the American flag and the Syrian national flag on the right. Khalil Bazzi was a big Syrian nationalist. He was advocating for the independence of the Syrian homeland back in the Middle East. He was well known. He traveled around the country sort of lobbying for, he was a very politically active person in this period, as well as someone who was a religious leader. And also, this picture shows men, women, and children. Right? This shows that there were families here, that the family was participating, right? So this is the thing that makes the Syrian community, as I pointed out before, different from other parts of the Arab community. Here's Khalil Bazzi again. So this is the second mosque, which opens in the city, sort of officially calling itself a mosque. It was the Universal Islamic Society. It opened on Hastings Street in 1925. So what was Hastings Street known for?
I-75.
Today, Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, all that, right? So before the area, so it was always called Black Bottom. That's because of the soil there and the fact that it was a low area in the city. But before it became the center of the black community of Detroit, it was also sort of just on the west side of the downtown area. It was where a lot of newly arriving immigrants lived. And a lot of these newly arriving immigrants were, again, from the Middle East, right? So along Hastings Street, you had a bunch of coffee houses, which were an institution that were very important in the community before there were mosques and all these other social institutions. This one, the New Oriental Hall, which was a coffee house / social house, became a mosque in 1925 called the Universal Islamic Society. And again, I want to emphasize the word universal. All right, so this is a mosque that's open for all Muslims. And again, we have more than one religious leader here. We have Sheikh Khalil Bazzi on the right. On the left, we have a man named Duz Muhammad Ali, who was a Sudanese man who grew up in England. And he had been in England prior to World War I. He had been a very radical intellectual who published a newspaper called the New Asia and Orient Review, which was seeking to bring together the political interests of South Asians, Africans, and Middle Easterners, Arabs, in this anti-colonial effort to overthrow the British and the French and kick them out of their homelands. And he's the one who's sort of an early Islamist. He thought that Islam was the thing that unified India and the Middle East and Africa. And if the Muslims could organize as Muslims, they could overthrow the colonial powers. Marcus Garvey went to England and wrote for him, interned with his newspaper, and was politically inspired by him. In the war, the paper folded, and he came to America, and he was an editorialist for Marcus Garvey's magazine. What was it called? The Negro World. Yeah, the Negro World in New York. So he was invited to Detroit, just like some of these other people. He was invited here by the South Asian Muslim community, who really saw him as having a very political, progressive message. So this mosque opened, and here's a picture, which again, this picture was organized for the press, right? This is not an actual picture of people praying. You'll see they have shoes on, and there's all this other evidence of that. But Mr. Bazzi's leading the prayer. We have Duz Ali right here, and here we have Shah al-Abidin, who is the head of the South Asian Muslim community. We have a lot of Turks in the picture. We have another missionary from Sudan here in the background. I won't go into his story. Right? This is a Muslim community that knew each other. They worship together. And before I get into that, I am going to give you one quote, and I did look this one up ahead of time, so I can find it in the book really quickly. So there was an Indian man who came to Detroit in this period. He was brought here by Ford, and he wrote a memoir about his time in Detroit. So I just want to read what he says. I was invited to the meeting of the Islamic Association by two Indian Muslims who knew me from New York. Indeed, in the small group, there were individuals from various races and nationalities, including a blackest Negro from some remote part of Africa. Contrasting with all the local white churches in which the Negroes were not permitted even to offer prayer, The small Islamic group of diverse races was a sort of illustration of Islamic unity. I was asked to speak to the group. I didn't know what to say. At the time, I was skeptical about all religions, yet I didn't know a rational argument against them. Hence, I said to the gathering that various religions taught ways for the salvation hereafter, though no one had returned to inform us about the other world. But in the present world, despite all sorts of beautiful teaching of all the other religions, it is only Islam that practices real fellowship among all the human beings. Okay? So this is 1925, and here we see it manifest in their worship. And then this also is sort of reinforcing ideas that were circulating in the period. Picture of Noble Drew Ali on the left, who founded the Moorish Science Temple, which was an African-American sort of autonomous, independent American religious tradition that borrowed from Islam, that borrowed from a lot of other religious teachings as well. But importantly, it taught people that they had an identity that was separate from the identity they had been taught about themselves here in America. And so he said, you're not Negroes, you're not enslaved people, you are in fact Asiatics, you're Moors. Trying to restore to people a noble history. And on the right, we have Fard Muhammad, who was, by all accounts, a South Asian Muslim from the Caribbean who came to America, and he worked with the UNIA, and he also worked with the Moorish Science Temple, right? So he was sort of educating himself about African American liberation politics of the period. And he met the wife of Elijah Muhammad, who was not called Elijah Muhammad. It was called Elijah Poole in the period. He was a peddler. So many South Asians couldn't work on the assembly line, and so they worked as peddlers. And he sold lingerie and black bottom, and that's how he met Clara Poole at the time. And the two of them started talking, and eventually he met Elijah Muhammad, and he was trying to explain Islam to them. Next thing you know, you have this new religious tradition called the Nation of Islam, which was also founded really just a few blocks away from that Universal Islamic Society. So these people were sort of circulating in the same network.
Did they follow basically the same tenets?
So the thing about, so Fard Muhammad, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the Nation of Islam in his very early period. He started what he called the Temple of Allah in Black Bottom in that same period, very near the mosque. And but really quickly, there were people who were trying to get into the movement, and they were doing all these things to impress him, and he didn't articulate a very clear Islamic vision. I think he was more influenced by the Moorish Science Temple and some of the UNIA teaching. So he was kind of giving a mixed religious background. But anyway, so he was actually, he went into hiding because the police were looking for him because of all these things. So they immediately set up what they called the Universal Islamic Academy, which was it wasn't called that. It's called the University of Islam, which was a parochial school for the African American community. And but the police didn't like this, and they kept trying to bust up the school because they said that it wasn't a real school, it wasn't certified, so on and so forth. So they were trying to arrest all the kids for truancy. There were lots of things that happened. There was one man who wanted to get into the community, and so he had a prayer service in his house one night, and he had heard this thing about sacrifice. That there's an Eid al-Adha, a feast of the sacrifice. So what he did is he invited someone sitting on the front row just like you. So if I ask you to come up here and sit on the table, don't listen to me. He said, come up here and sit on the table, and the guy came up on the table and he stabbed him and sacrificed him. And then he did this because he wanted to get into the community. Of course, this was not something the community was teaching in any way, but the headlines in the Detroit newspaper said, Muslim kills human sacrifice worship service, right? So imagine how the Muslims in Highland Park felt about this, or the Muslims who had moved here to Dearborn. They're like, oh, look at the newspaper headline with, kind of like reading the newspaper today, actually, if you're a Muslim American. But anyway, so it was a problem, and he basically, so Fard kind of went into hiding, and then Elijah Muhammad also very quickly got kicked out of Detroit. And part of this was because, again, he was teaching something. The teachings of the Nation of Islam were just totally radically different. They believed that men are gods. They had
We're not?
They believe that they have like a reverse race mythology that said that white men were the devils who would, maliciously, all this stuff, like black men were truly the better people, but there were these crazy white men who would enslave them, and it was like this, they had a reverse narrative. But anyway, but the Muslim leaders of Detroit, so one thing when I talk to people, both in the black community, well, especially in the black Muslim community, they're always saying to me, oh, these Muslims are over there in Dearborn, and they didn't do anything. They didn't come over here and correct us. They don't care about us. They're racist. They don't care about us because we're black people. I'm like, no, if you talk to the imams, they went. They tried to talk to Elijah Muhammad. Every time he came to town, they had meetings with him. I mean, they were working it. But they had their own religious traditions. They've developed their own autonomous religious traditions, the Nation of Islam. But it's not a coincidence that it happened here in the city, right? Because there were so many Muslims, and in particular, there was a political movement in that period that the Nation of Islam really borrowed from. Or was a part of. So here we have the Rouge plant. So we also have in this early period, this is Salina Elementary School. I'm sure quite a few of you in this room went to the school. This is a picture from the early 1920s. The school had just opened. And I love this meeting because, again, here, what are these people doing? You have the American flag, and you have these Syrian nationalist flags in the background, right? This was a meeting. It's mostly men. There are women in the picture. There are priests in the background. I can't find Khalil Bezi in the photo. I have tried. I'm sure he was there. But anyway, this just shows that the community was organizing, the Arab community was organized on these political grounds too, as well as the religious ones. And it was at a meeting like this. So if you look at other parts of the country in this period, these are mosques from North Dakota, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, from Michigan City, Indiana, right? The Muslim community was growing. They were building mosques. So here you had this community in Detroit, and they were starting to feel like, we tried, we were first, what's going on, right? So at a meeting very like the one in this picture, people got together at the school, and they said, we need to start a mosque, right? So here, the Depression happens, and as soon as people are back, slowly going back to work, finally getting some money in their pocket again, one of the first things they did is they opened 2 mosques. So this is one of them, Progressive Arabian Hashmie Society. And at that meeting, you had people, the Arab community in Dearborn at the time, there were Christians, there were Muslims, there were Sunni, there were Shia. It was a pretty diverse community. But this name, so the group of men who were in that hall and met and voted on that they were going to build a mosque and what they were going to name the mosque, this name was kind of problematic for part of the people in the community. So does anybody want to tell me why this name was problematic? Yes?
Perhaps associated with the Hashemite Prince Faisal of the time?
The Hashemite Prince Faisal, why would he be controversial?
The Arab revolt against the Ottomans with the British.
But wouldn't that be something that people would want to celebrate if they were all Arab nationalists?
Sunni versus Shia kind of thing?
But Sunni Shia thing, wasn't he a Sunni?
Yes, but he also claimed lineage to the Prophet as well.
Yes, because he was from Beit Hashem.
Yes.
Okay, so in fact, this is the issue, right? So most Americans associate Hashmi with the Hashemites, like King Hussein of Jordan or King Abdullah today. It is a Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, right? So we assume that the word Hashemite is a Sunni word. But when I say he's from Beit Hashem or he's from Ahl al-Bayt, right, this is from the family of the Prophet is what I'm saying. So what does this imply? Shiism. Yes, this was a Shia congregation, and the Sunni didn't want to be in the thing that called itself Arabian Hashemite Society, right? They were like, wait a minute, we're all Muslims. We're not just Ahl al-Bayt, right? So this mosque opened in 1937 to great fanfare. It's in a former bank building. Downstairs was a social hall. The bank was foreclosed on during the Depression. Upstairs, they had a mosque and a school where they taught religious education.
It's not Michigan Avenue.
No, this is in the South End.
Yeah,
This is the South End.
So it's still there?
It's not still there. The building
No.
burned down in the 70s.
Okay.
So here's the second mosque that they opened. This one opened in 1938. This mosque is still there. This is the oldest mosque in Michigan. It's the American Muslim Society. The sign here says Islamic Mosque over the door. Masjid al So these pictures were taken in the 1950s. I want to ask people in the audience if anybody recognizes anyone in the right picture. I'll give you a hint. He's got a statue standing outside the door of this building.
It looks like where we, in the front.
Oh, yeah, there he is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, he sure is.
I'm sure there's a pointer on this, but yeah, there's Orville Hubbard. So, does this surprise you?
Yes.
Why does it surprise you? What have you heard about Orville Hubbard that would make
Tried
this?
to close down the South End. Yeah.
He was not just racist, he was an anti-Arab racist. He tried to close down the South End. This is what I always heard too. The people who were in the community at this time said he always came to their fundraisers. So why would he come to their fundraisers? He loved raw kibbe. They said he would always go after, if there was raw kibbe, he would be there. Okay, so I'm not being entirely facetious, but he was also, I mean, I believe me, I know who he was. He was a politician, and he was a pretty good one. I mean, he was a racist. I'm not saying he wasn't a racist, but he was a good politician, right? So he did his homework. He was down there in the south end of Dearborn, being the kind of mayor who went out there on the street, okay? So here we had these two mosques that were, just a few blocks away from each other in the south end, the heart of the Arab community. And people always said to me, so some people say that they're uncomfortable with the fact that there were these two mosques so near each other. Now, the neighborhood also had a Romanian Catholic church, and I think it had a Romanian Protestant church. It might have had a Romanian Orthodox church. How many churches did that neighborhood had? It was a very mixed, diverse neighborhood with people from all over the world, especially people from Eastern Europe. And they had churches on every corner, too. It wasn't just a neighborhood that had mosques in it. And they didn't worry that they had a Romanian Catholic church and a Romanian Orthodox church because the community was Catholic and it was Orthodox, right? For the Muslim community, they're a little more like, we're all Muslims, we're all part of the same ummah, we should be able to get over these differences. But the fact that they had these differences means that it was like evidence of the moral completeness of the community. You know what I mean? They could each do what they really thought was right in their hearts. And the community supported each other, the two mosques. When one group had a fundraiser, the other group would go, they would donate bread or whatever. When the other one had one, they would go. As one, Ardella Jabara, one of the women in this picture, one of the sort of founders of the Women's Society of the Mosque, very active in the mosque, she said to me, we all ate the same mujaddara, right? So mujaddara is like a ordinary food that people eat. They were from the same community, right? All this stuff didn't matter. When one group had a good Sunday school teacher, all the kids would go learn the Quran at that school, and the others, and then they would run out of gas, and the other one would get a teacher, and they'd go over there. Right? Sheikh Bazi might have done their marriage, or Sheikh Karub might have done their marriage. It totally depended on what was going on at the time, right? So anyway, here we're fast forwarding a little bit to the 1950s. And so anything else, other than the fact that Hubbard's here, anything surprising about this picture?
One's men, one's women.
One's men, one's women.
No,
No headscarves. And my students are always like, oh, like they can't imagine that there are no headscarves on. So this is what the mosque looked like on the inside. They used to call it the basement. Some people called it the basement because it was kind of built halfway into the ground. You could see the building like that. They called the other place, they called Hashmie Hall in this period, they called it the coal mine. Because the pollution in the south end was so great that every time you went into one of these buildings, you'd have to clean off all the surfaces. It was just really the people, if you're from the neighborhood, you'll know that you could always tell what side of the street somebody lived on because the paint on that side of their car would be worn off and the paint on the other side would be okay based on the smoke from the factory. From the Rouge, yeah. So anyway, this is a big fundraiser they're having because they're finally in the 1950s, right? All these people come home from the war. So our immigration laws changed in the 1920s, and in particular, it became very difficult for people from the Middle East to come here anymore. Because they put in place a quota system where you could have a certain number of people come each year based on your group's percentage of the population. And this was designed, the laws were put in place not to keep people from coming from the Middle East. They were actually designed to keep people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe coming. This was a nativist period of an earlier generation that was really specifically anti-Roman Catholic. The immigration laws that were passed in 1965 were like another part of the Civil Rights Act. They were the descendants of Roman Catholic immigrants, again from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, saying, look, we're citizens too, change those laws so that they don't affect, so that they don't continue to discriminate against us, to treat us like we're second-class citizens, okay? But so in this period, immigration really slowed down. So this was a period of intense Americanization, right? Because if you're a Muslim community here in America in this period, you don't have constant immigration happening, then you're really kind of on your own. You got to do things your own way, okay? And that's what's happening. So here, the second generation of kids, some of whom you see in this picture, they were raised in these congregations. They come back from the war. As some people said to me, many of you in this room probably knew Haj Chuck Alawan. Anybody know Haj Chuck? Yeah. He said, we would drive down Woodward Avenue, and we would see these big, giant, beautiful churches. And we would think, why can't we have one of those? Why do we have the basement and the coal mine? So the community really started in this period wanting to show itself again, going back to that earlier period where they wanted a mosque that looked like a mosque. And this is just another illustration of some of the effort that the congregation was going through to be viable. So this is I just love this letter. I hope that my Muslim brothers will come to the Islamic Mosque in Dearborn this Friday for a party featuring Arabic music and American dances. This gathering will take place every Friday night at the mosque for all the Muslim youth. Bring and send your children so they can meet us and we can know each other and be united. Please help me, children of Islam, so that our group will grow and we can be proud of ourselves in front of others. Separation from each other will do nothing but degrade the status and name of Arabs and Muslims. For this reason, I beg my brothers to make your children attend every Friday night at the Islamic Mosque. And he signs it, Muhammad Hassan, who is a board member of the mosque, but he also has the imam of the mosque sign this. So I heard you sort of go, oh, at the mention of dancing, right? So when we think about kids going to the mosque on Friday night these days, we don't necessarily think of them going there, not only are they going to do Arabic dancing, but they're going to do American dancing. Whoa, this is really something, right? So again, this is a part of the neighborhood. This, in addition to being a house of worship, it was an ethnic club. This is all the community had in this period. They didn't have, Warren Avenue and one restaurant after another and Greenfield Manor. They didn't have all these institutions, right? The mosque had to be like a complete community for them. And here what he's saying is that he wants the Muslim generation to not be going to some dance, some bar. He wants them to come to the mosque, right? Yes. It's still there, yeah. It's at the corner of, it's like where Dix and Verner intersect.
Oh, okay.
It's in the south end, yeah. And again, he's a little defensive, right? He knows that he's offering something radical here, and it is kind of unusual, that's why I'm quoting it. But nonetheless, this was part of both their Americanization process and their investment in keeping Islam alive for the second generation. So it was in this same period, again, at the close of World War II, so a lot was happening in the Middle East. Lebanon gets its independence, and Albania, where the imam on the left was from, is very quickly after the war is taken over by communists. This man's father was the Grand Mufti of Albania. He studied at Al-Azhar University in Cairo and was good friends with King Farouk, who was also Albanian. King Farouk's mother was Albanian. Anyway, these two imams both came to the United States in 1947. They were both brought here by their congregation. Imam Shiri was not like Khalil Bazi. He was not a guy who really didn't speak English. Well, he didn't speak English when he came here, but he was a really well-trained scholar. He studied in Najaf in Iraq, which was the center of Shiism. He had several books under his belt before he was brought to America. And he was recommended to the community by why can't I think of his name? The first Speaker of the Parliament in Lebanon, who was also from South Lebanon and was a Shia religious leader in the community. And so for him to come to America, he came to America and addressed the United Nations on behalf of Palestine, this guy. And while he was in the country, he came and he stopped in Dearborn, and people were like, we were so embarrassed that he came to Hashmie Hall. We wanted to have a big mosque to show him, right? Anyway, he recommended Sheikh Shiri because he knew he was an activist and he knew he was a builder. So he sent Imam Shiri to Detroit. Imam Wehbi was brought here by people in the Albanian community under very similar circumstances. But anyway, I just want to read something that appeared in the newspaper when Sheikh Shiri came. So he was, at this point, when Sheikh Shiri came to America, Hashmie Hall was 12 years old. It had been in existence for 12 years. It was a mosque upstairs, and downstairs they had the social hall. It was a school on the weekends where they taught Islam. Okay, I just want you to keep in mind when I read this. The Arab immigrant community of this republic, in our opinion, does not face a more truly dangerous issue than that of the new Arab American generation and how to instill in them adequate knowledge and guidance. Generation and how to instill in them adequate knowledge and guidelines that will allow for the preservation of good traditions and customs, given that their progenitors let go of these over time and let them drift away in the new American ocean. Here, the community needs to resort to doctors of the soul, devoted religious servants, versed in spiritual and literary knowledge, able to express their culture and learning in order to save the new generation from the danger of melting into the body of an American nation that does not believe in any lofty religion. Right? So here we have, I mean, to me, that's just such an interesting quote. First, it's more or less what I read to you at the beginning of the talk, right?
Right.
So this idea of cultural loss. I also love the idea. So I don't have a picture of the first prayer that he gave in the mosque, but I gave that picture away before I copied it, which was stupid of me. I should go get it back from him. But anyway, so he has this service in the Hashmie hall where he puts down a big green rug on the floor and he says, "I now declare this a mosque." And, you know, Imam Wahbi was there. I don't think Imam Karub was there, but so many leaders from from his congregation were there. You had representatives of the Muslim community in Chicago, Cleveland, all these religious leaders from around the country came to this opening of this new mosque in Dearborn, in a mosque. Let's see what's next. Okay, yeah, here, these pictures were taken a few years later in Hashmie Hall. So what happened to Imam Shiri? He didn't speak English. So he couldn't speak to that new American generation he was so worried about. Not only that, the mosque already had an imam, Khalil Bazi. You know, he wasn't a grand scholar like Sheikh Shiri, but he was still there. He had his faction of supporters in the community. And what's more, you know, a few weeks after he had this thing where he put the prayer rug down on the floor and said, "I declare this a mosque," he had another grand opening for his Islamic school. And this was kind of like more than people who have been supporting the mosque for the last 12 or 13 years could handle. So he got kicked out of town too. He went to Michigan City, Indiana, where he led the religious community there. There was also a big Shia community in Michigan City. And one of the things he did is he learned English there. Another thing he said, the most important thing he learned there, he said when he came back to town, was that he learned that in America, women run the mosque, which is a very important lesson. But anyway, so this is what Hashmie Hall looked like in the 1960s. So we see that there's a school going on. The kids are being taught to pray. Down at the bottom of the picture, we see that this is a funeral for someone, very active social hall. It was a social hall, but it was also very clearly a mosque. The Albanians got their mosque. I know originally it was a church. There was an African-American congregation that got started, a Sunni African-American congregation that got started in the city. And if you look at this text, you know, this is in their mission statement. He says, to promote the religion as illustrated by the Holy Prophet Muhammad over 1,300 years ago. What he was trying to do in this statement is say, we're not the nation of Islam. That's what this whole thing is. Be it resolved that the incorporated members of this corporation are not connected with the black Muslims, nor any other cult at home or abroad, directly or indirectly, nor any secret societies, or the Communist Party. Be it further resolved that this religion is not prejudiced toward races, colors, language, or national origins. Right? So this narrative really has staying power here. It's very important. And his congregation was harassed by the Detroit police. They were constantly being followed around town. The police were suspicious of them, both because of the association of the Nation of Islam and also because many members of the black Muslim community had refused to fight in World War II. Right? So they were seen as being a dissident group.
Is this the same Muslim Brotherhood that's in Egypt?
No. It's it is in such a loose way that you can't even say yes.
Okay.
I mean, they mean the Brotherhood of Muslims,
Okay.
not the political institution, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
So here's what the American Muslim Society looked like when they completed their edition. Here's Imam Karub there, much older man than he was in the earlier pictures. But this is a nice building, right? A lot of you guys were familiar with this if you lived in the South End. You probably remember the mosque when it looked this way. Yeah, Dixon Werner, yeah. And the dome on top was very nice. All right, so now they finally had a building that looked like a mosque, right? I hope, yes, this is one of the first prayers they had in their new prayer space upstairs. Imam Karub had always wanted to refer to the mosque as Masjid al, which means like the central mosque, the main mosque of the city of Detroit. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that there are a lot of Turks in the picture, Arabs, a lot of South Asian Muslims, right? This really was a meeting place, a congregating place for the Muslims of the city. And the other thing that was interesting about the picture with Orville Hubbard in it was there were African Americans in that picture too. Yeah, and I always thought that's interesting. You know, I'm from the South, and I know a lot of segregationists in the South. The one thing they didn't want to do was eat with a black person, and I don't know if Hubbard went that far with his attitudes. But there's a picture of him eating with African Americans, so that to me is kind of interesting. So the Muslim community was changing in America again in the 1950s. They were part of America, so the prosperity that the country experienced, the Muslim community experienced as well. This is a banquet that was held in Detroit in 1957 at the Statler Hotel, which probably a lot of people remember, big place for banquets. Again, if you look at the picture, this is what the Muslim community looked like in the 1950s. Again, in the hijab, as we see it today, was not necessarily worn by people in the south of Lebanon or in Beirut or in Cairo in this period. Really only elite people wore it and very peasant-oriented people wore it. But the middle class didn't necessarily wear it, right? It didn't matter. So in here we have this picture from the United States where the only picture even wearing head coverings at all are African Americans. And for them, wearing a head covering is important because how do you show America that you're a Muslim? An Arab might be taken to be a Muslim, or at least their difference is recognized because they're ethnically different. But for an African American, you want to really signify that. You want to tell that story through your clothing. But anyway, I like this picture because it shows there was an organization called the Federation of Islamic Associations of the United States and Canada that was founded, again, shortly after World War II. It was founded by Syrian immigrants mostly, but if you looked at the list over on the right of all the organizations that sponsored this dinner, it would be a very impressive array of the diversity of Muslim institutions that existed in Detroit at the time. But the point was that a lot of them had fought in World War II, and in World War II, the U.S. government did not recognize Islam as like an American religion, and so if you had dog tags and you fought in the military, you had to pick Protestant, Catholic, Jew, atheist. Those were your options.
Wow.
So if you're a Muslim, which one do you pick? Because basically, this is the guy who's going to come and visit you in the hospital if you're ill, and if you die, this is the way you're going to be buried, whichever one of those you pick. Okay, so this is a really serious thing. So after the war, they wrote a letter to President Ike, and they said, we want to be recognized. We want Islam on your dog tags. We want Muslim chaplains in the army. We're American just like you are. And look, we spilled blood on the battlefield. We've proven ourselves. And they were in World War I too. And Ike didn't even write him back. So they said, we need a representative body. So they created this federation. And here's the federation. And it's about 10 years old at this point. They come to Detroit for their banquet. Huge victory, huge celebration for them. If you could see the podium, you'd see that Imam Shidri was one of the main speakers. He spoke in English, really impressed people. And he was very quickly invited back to Detroit. So this is also just another era of growth. We have the mosque that you guys have seen out on the Harper Woods Mosque that you see right off of 94 on the east side of the city when you're going east. You guys haven't seen this mosque from 94? I'm like, there's the mosque, they're the Albanians.
Dearborn people don't go east to Woodward.
I guess, yeah, it's still there. No, it's in Harper Woods. It's on the east side of Detroit. This is the Albanian mosque on the left. And on the right, yes, that mosque is still there. That mosque is where? It's in Joy Road in Greenfield. Yes, this is a Detroit mosque, but it's a Dearborn congregation. They built it there because they could get the land there, but also because it was halfway between Dearborn and Highland Park. Right? And there was a Muslim community in Highland Park that also had a mosque in this period. So they combined resources from Dearborn and from Highland Park, and they put a mosque sort of halfway. Now, the thing I love about that mosque is, does anybody know where Henry Ford is buried? Right there, like one storefront over from here. So I just love it. You can't, if you're an Arab American, a Muslim American from this area, Henry Ford is just in your DNA, really. But anyway, yeah, this is the Islamic Center of America. So these two buildings have in common, look at them. I mean, they were built in the late 50s, early 60s. They're like mid-century modern. You can't be more progressive, modern American than these two institutions. And that dome that they put on the front, this didn't come in until the late 70s. So it looked like a bank building or like some really boring industrial building. The Islamic Center was way cooler. I just love that building. Here's what it looked like on the inside. Look at that space. That is so cool. That is so cool. So this is what the Muslim community looked like in 1962. Again, there was this sense of optimism and growth. There was the prayer space, which the men are sitting in on the left. That's like a social hall that they had. I've been to more funerals than I even want to think about in that space. And then, of course, those are the women in the prayer space, too, looking very Jackie-esque, I think, here. So this is, a community that was growing, that was progressive, that was looking to the future. So, yeah, it was a group of young people who went to Michigan City and convinced Imam Shiri to come back to Detroit and lead them because he really was a scholar and was a progressive thinker. So once he learned English, he was brought back to town. And again, so I just love this because Shiri was so worried about Americanization. Okay, but by the 60s, he'd been in America for 15, 20 years. And this is a wedding at the Islamic Center of America. So he was one of those reformers who said, you guys aren't Muslim enough. Well, in the old days, they had a piano in the social hall at the Islamic Center of America. They had a big white piano, and they would play the wedding march as women walked down the aisle. Right, this is not what Islamic weddings in Detroit look like today. It just isn't. If any of you haven't been, they just don't look like this, okay? And I also love this picture. I was joking with the bride. I told her I was going to show the picture where she's actually where he's getting the garter belt off her thigh. I get a picture in the mosque, but there is no picture of that, but I still tease her. But that is her husband throwing the garter belt over the shoulder, right? This is a community that had been in America for, 60 years now, 50 years. The kids had grown up here. They were completely comfortable being here, just like they were completely comfortable being Muslim. They were having their wedding in a mosque. And here I just like to show this picture because, like I mentioned, that there had been a rift between Sheikh Bazzi and it wasn't really between Sheikh Bazzi and Sheikh Shiri. It was more between their supporters. But here's a picture of the social hall of the mosque. This is Sheikh Bazzi as an old man giving a lecture in the social hall. This is in the 70s. I just love the big hair on the kids. And Imam Shiri sitting in front of him, right? I just want to show that the community really came back together very well, but also to show that the congregation was about so much. It wasn't just about weddings and dances. This was a sermon, this was a religious sermon that was taking place in the mosque. So I won't go into the Islamic Revolution. I'm still back in the 60s. African American community, this is what they looked like in the same period. African American Muslim community, this is that same congregation. I showed you a slide up for them. In 1963, this new organization called the Muslim Student Association was founded, and they had their first big annual banquet in Detroit. Masjid al Mu'mineen hosted them. Right? So this was showing a real solidarity between the new immigrants and the African American Muslims. This is all these foreign students who studied at University of Michigan and Wayne State University, real intellectuals from Pakistan, from Egypt, from Syria. They were kind of a new kind of Muslim, right? These were people who were raised in a period of universal education in the Middle East. These are people who didn't just practice Islam because they'd been taught it by their parents or their grandparents. They studied Islam. Right, so there was sort of a shift taking place in the Muslim world that was, promoting more of a direct relationship between the individual and the religious text. It was also morally a little bit more conservative than the Islam that had come before. It was more, like an oral tradition that you passed on from one person to another, right? So Islam itself was going through a sort of big sea change in this period that also had to do with the politics of the region. Right, so we had this Arab nationalist phase that had been in the 1920s and 30s, and by the 40s and 50s, the Cold War was raging, and the Arab nationalism had clearly not brought the kind of liberation and autonomy and opportunity to the region that people wanted. So people started shifting. Islam was offering sort of a critique of Arab nationalism. Right, so this was all happening overseas, and these people were coming together in America. Right, and coming together in these American institutions. So these are all pictures of Masjid al Mu'mineen, which was in Virginia Park in Detroit. We also have massive change happening in the black community. So Elijah Muhammad dies in 1975. This is what the Nation of Islam Temple on Linwood, it's called Masjid Wali Muhammad today. This is what it looked like in 1974. Right, this is what a service looked like in 1974, and the picture on the right was taken in 1976. a religious service. So you see any differences between those two pictures?
The seating.
The seating, men and women sitting together, the guy wearing a uniform. This looks like a regular old meeting that could be anywhere in America. This looks like a mosque. They're sitting on the floor. And who's that standing in front of them? That's a Syrian immigrant. He's still alive today. His name is Masjid al Mu'mineen. He's a doctor. He lives in Farmington. But he was sent here by Elijah Muhammad's son, Warth Deen Muhammad, who took over the nation when his father died, and he brought the nation into the fold of the universal Islam. Right? So now the African-American Muslim community, the majority of them are Sunni Muslims. And this transition was really important in Detroit because it brought all those Nation of Islam people into the same ummah with all the other Muslims in Detroit. So you kind of had these two big transitions. So the black Muslim community in America now, instead of being people who had been Sunni and kind of living these quiet lives before, the majority of them were actually people who came from the nation and had recently converted to Islam. And if you look at the Arab community or the Albanian community, the 60s were really important because the immigration laws changed in that period and were really opened up to the rest of the world. Exactly what we're trying to reverse right now. Brought a lot of new cultural diversity, religious diversity, ethnic, racial diversity to the country that was really kind of radically new. So what happened very quickly is that the Muslims of Dearborn, those families that had been here for 60, 80 years, who were as Dearborn as you could be, they were here, many of them before the city became Dearborn. Suddenly they were a minority too. You had wars happening in the Middle East, one after another, new groups were coming, and those people came to Detroit, and they looked at the garter throwing, threw it over my shoulder, they looked at the pianos in the mosques, they looked at the dances at the Federation events, and they judged them. Okay, so again, my narrative repeats itself. The war, this is the period when Hubbard was trying to get rid of the neighborhood in the South End. This event down here is the Dix Mosque, where they're lobbying to have the call to prayer. You had a real alliance between the Arab Workers Caucus and DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. Does everybody know about DRUM? Yeah. Here? Yeah. They were an African-American, sort of a radical African-American group who were like, how come there aren't any, we don't have any UAW representatives who are black in the Dodge main factory where 70% of the workforce is black? How come we're being discriminated against, passed over for promotion? And so they started this DRUM revolutionary, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, and there was a Ford revolutionary movement. It's the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And they had an Arab caucus. The black workers saw that the only people who had it worse than them in the factory, and I'm quoting them in some of their newsletters, were the Arabs. Because at this point, Yemeni workers were coming in who were dark-skinned. Ford always thought that dark-skinned people belonged in the engine room, that dark-skinned people, blacks or Yemenis or Bangladeshis, that they could take the heat better. So they were put in the furnace room and stuff like that. So that was true. So the Yemenis were put in the furnace room of the factories, and they didn't speak English, so they couldn't complain. This sort of thing. So the African-American workers saw that the Arab workers had it worse than them. If you guys know the name Ish Ahmed, you guys know Ish? This is where Ish, did his political chops. He was the leader of the Arab Workers Caucus.
Now, Sally, why do you have Leonard Woodcock's name up there?
Okay, so the Arab Workers Caucus, the big issue that they were organizing around was the fact that the UAW in 1973 bought a bunch of Israeli war bonds. There was an Arab-Israeli war in 1973, and the UAW Local 600, that's our local in the South End, bought $750,000 worth of Israeli war bonds. And one of the slogans of DRUM was, there's a movie about DRUM called Finally Got the News. So do you know how that slogan ends? Finally got the news how our dues is being used. Okay, and so this was the Arab Workers Caucus had that. They didn't want, so they were protesting. Leonard Woodcock was the head of the UAW. He came to Detroit, gave a big talk. They went and protested. Actually, they invited an Israeli official, I can't remember who he was, to be their keynote at their banquet. So the Arabs walked off the job. They closed the Dodge main. They shut down one assembly line and had such a slowdown on the other one that the factory had to close. This is a big victory for the Arab Workers Caucus. The DRUM people supported them, but of course, most of the workers were Yemeni. They didn't have citizenship. When the next round of layoffs happened, those Yemenis got laid off first. They didn't come back. So it was like a pyramid. This is also the period when, so the South End by this period was looking kind of ragged. Did any of you grow up in the South End? A few? Yeah, and by the 70s it was looking pretty ragged. The pollution had worn people down. You also had the Levy Asphalt Company that was just across the border in Detroit on the other side of the neighborhood. That was, getting sludge from the Dearborn factory and driving it through the neighborhood, and the neighbors were complaining, and one thing led to another. So Mr. Levy and Mr. Ford were working together to try and get rid of this neighborhood, and they could just use it all for industry. And the mayor didn't really necessarily like the people who lived in the neighborhood. So he also was, he's quoted with all sorts of anti-Arab statements that he said in this period. But because this was the same period when we had war happening in the Middle East, we had new immigrants coming, these were the only Arab mosques here. I mean, Hashmie Hall, the Islamic Center opened in 1962, right? Those homes were being destroyed before that mosque was even really built. So if you're a new Arab coming to this country, you're coming from Palestine, your life has been disrupted by Israeli occupation, if you're a person from the south of Lebanon who's been displaced by Palestinian refugees, or whatever, you come to America, you want to be with other Muslims. That's just completely normal. So the Muslims started moving into this neighborhood. That was the center of their neighborhood. That's where the grocery stores, that's where Sereni's dad had the restaurant. Right, this was the heart of the neighborhood. So it was the Poles could go anywhere. They had churches all over town. The Italians had churches all over town, right? So people could move and move up. But in this neighborhood, although a lot of people were moving up, a lot of new people were moving in, right? So it was the Arab community that fought to defend the neighborhood in this famous landmark case, Catherine Amon versus the city of Dearborn. And I'm not going to go into all the detail. But yeah, so also in this period, we have this. We don't just have Muslim institutions taking off, we have Arab institutions that are taking off. Yeah, so I'm getting a time signal in the back. Yeah, I could go on and on and on. I have lots of slides here. Yeah, so I've only gotten us up to the 60s. But yeah, so we have this new Muslim solidarity that's taking place in the city at the time. Basically what happens, this is what the Toledo, I just like these pictures from inside mosques to show you what mosques looked like in this period. But you also had these new immigrants who came. Again, like I said, they had been politicized in a different way than the earlier Muslim communities who were here. In this case, this is a picture that was taken in the 1980s. This was taken by Millard Berry, who a lot of you probably know, a photographer who worked for the city of Dearborn for many years. Or he worked for the Press and Guide. Yeah, not for the city. Yeah, this is one of his pictures inside the Dick's Mosque. So what happened is these new people came, and just like Mufti Sadiq had done in the 1920s, and just like Imam Shidri did in the 1940s, they judged the Muslim community they found here. And the Yemeni community in particular, they were frustrated because the Dick's Mosque at this point, there was even a debate in their community. Should we hold Friday prayer on Friday? Or should we hold it on Sunday? And they had like the head of the mosque, Mr. I'm blanking on his name. Not the religious leader of the mosque, but the head of the board said, okay, we're going to have a vote. And he put this vote to the congregation. He said, can we move our Jummah prayer to Sunday? Because everybody works on Friday, nobody can come. And the mosque said, no, we're going to have the Jummah prayer, we're going to have it on Friday, right? But the fact that they had this vote at all was kind of shocking to the new people. They used to celebrate the Eid, the religious holidays, on Saturdays. Why did they do that? Because they all worked. They couldn't get off work. The schools weren't going to close for the Islamic holidays. If you do it on Saturday, everybody can come. They were a minority. They were a teeny little minority. Right? They were doing their best to keep the traditions alive. But the new people came and they said, okay, it's Eid al-Fitr. We're going to go in the mosque and pray. And at one point, they broke down the door of the mosque to go in and pray. They said, it's the Eid, and they didn't have the key, and they said, to hell with these American Muslims, we're going to go in and pray. They called themselves the Musallin, the people who would pray, right? And they were mostly Yemeni, Palestinian. So this group took over the board of the mosque, and they changed all the rules of the mosque. They said, women, you got to cover your hair. They took the American-born people and said, you guys can't teach Sunday school anymore. We're going to teach Sunday school, right? I mean, this happens in religious institutions everywhere. So this is so the American Muslim Society really went through a serious transition. It was a brutal one for the community, right? The people who had founded that mosque, who had grown up in it, They had really given their sweat and their blood and their love to that mosque, and so they hated to be thrown out. It was a real rift in the community. They started a new mosque, which I'll show you a picture of in just a second. But this is also the 1980s at this point. We had the Iranian Revolution, which I didn't talk about earlier. We had the oil embargo, and now there was suddenly Islamophobia and hatred and fear in the community that people hadn't witnessed before. This is one of the women whose mother, this note was sent to Essie Abraham, so I'm sure a few people in the room know who Essie Abraham was. She was one of the founders of the mosque on Chase, a non-Arab woman who married into the Arab community but was a very devout Muslim and started a mosque. But this is a piece of hate mail. They wanted to build a mosque on Michigan Avenue. They thought, the Lebanese community said, okay, we're tired of being in the South End. We're going to build on Michigan Avenue in the center of Dearborn. We're here. Okay? And this is, why don't you teach your wild, primitive, Arab Lebanese camels how to live in a civilized country? You know, it's just this nasty, nasty, nasty piece of hate mail, which her daughter keeps in her wallet to this day, just to remind herself of what the community went through. So this is what, but the Dix Mosque nonetheless grew and grew and grew. So this is what it looked like in the 80s. Here they're sponsoring, the city started having these massive prayers where the whole community came together on the holidays. All the Muslims from all the different communities came together to pray. This is one that was being held in the South End. This is what the mosque looks like today. It's now one of the largest mosques in America. They regularly have 2,000 people there for an ordinary Friday prayer. It's quite amazing. Very friendly, welcoming congregation in the South End. And this is the Baca Mosque that was started on Chase in a former warehouse that Essie Abraham started. That congregation has grown. They now have a new mosque on Outer Drive. And anyway, so that's where I'm going to, just the fact that the history sort of repeats itself. Islam itself has changed over the course of this last century. So Islam here in America has changed. And a lot of these institutions that, you know, like when Imam Shiri came and he was critical of the religious practice he saw, he nonetheless came to embody that change over the course of his life. And a lot of the men who came in the 60s and the 70s who were also critical of the Arabs, you know, the Arab Muslims, the South Asians always say, oh, those Arabs in Dearborn, you know, they don't know what they're doing. When we came to America, their mosque was a club. It wasn't really a mosque, blah, blah, blah. But you go to their mosque today in Rochester Hills, in West Bloomfield, wherever these mosques are, and you'll see that they have yoga classes in the afternoon. They have chess clubs. One of the founders of the IAGD in Rochester Hills said to me, sometimes I feel like I'm not in the house of God. I feel like I'm in a fashion show. Okay. So my point is that these institutions are always, they always have this sort of tension between their desire to be religiously pure or to, you know, the people associate Islam with overseas, with another place. We don't really think it's authentically American. We still haven't embraced that. Even though there were Muslims here before there was the United States of America, a large percentage of the people who came here as slaves were Muslims. Islam is totally a part of the DNA of America, even though we don't quite recognize it. And here in Dearborn, given the long history of Islam in this community, I hope that we're coming to a point where we recognize it. Thank you for coming.